Hello, my name is Harlan Thompson, 70 years old. This is my story. I spent my entire life working hard for my son, giving him everything I never had: food, education, a home. I thought he would respect me when I grew old. But one night at dinner, I asked for more rice, and he didn't just say no. He threw water in my face. The whole family watched. No one stopped him. I didn't fight back. I just stood up, went to my room, and started planning. You won't believe what I did next. But before I tell you, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe for more. I was not born rich. My childhood was nothing but survival. Working from the time I was 12 years old, I carried bricks at construction sites, cleaned shops, and later worked odd jobs that kept me moving from morning to night. I never thought about myself much. Every coin I earned, every dollar I saved. I thought about my family when my wife gave birth to our only son, Michael. I made a promise to myself that he would never live the way I had to live. I wanted him to study, to grow up safe, to walk a path of comfort while I carried the weight behind him. I did not care if my back bent, if my knees gave out, if I worked 2 shifts a day, as long as Michael had food on the table and new shoes on his feet. That was my duty, and I carried it without complaint. When he was a boy, I bought him his first school uniform with my own hands. I remember skipping meals for a week so I could afford it. I used to come home with tired eyes, but seeing him smile when I handed him his books made me feel strong again. I paid for his schooling even when tuition went up and the bills piled on my table. I told myself education was the key to his future, so I cut corners on myself. But I never cut corners on him. When he wanted his first bicycle, I sold my old watch to buy it. Later, when he grew older and wanted his first car, I gave him money from my savings to buy one. That car was more expensive than anything I had ever owned for myself. But I didn't care. He was my pride. I wanted him to stand tall in front of his friends, not feel embarrassed because his father was poor. When he got married, I was the one who helped pay for the wedding. My wife and I lived modestly, but we wanted Michael to have a grand day, a day where everyone looked at him with respect. I even gave money for the down payment on his first house. I told him, "This is your family's start. Build on it." But what I did not say was that the money came from my own retirement savings. I thought it didn't matter because I believed he would take care of me later. I believed blood meant loyalty. I believed respect was automatic between father and son. I opened joint bank accounts with him thinking that sharing control would make him responsible. I thought if he saw his name on those accounts, he would take pride and treat the money with care. I thought it would remind him that all I earned for him. But instead, it made him arrogant. Instead of being grateful, he began to act like everything I had was already his. He used the money freely, bought gadgets, went on trips, entertained friends. Whenever I asked about savings, he said, "Don't worry, old man, I've got this." He never realized those accounts were still mine by law. He thought my generosity was his ownership. All my life I worked. All my life I gave. And I believed my son would treat me with dignity when I grew old and fragile. I thought he would say, "Father, you've done enough. Let me take care of you now." That was my dream. That was what kept me working in the rain, in the cold, and in pain. I carried groceries on my back. I fixed roofs in the heat. I drove trucks overnight. And every cent I made, I put into his future. My entire identity became the father who gave all. I was proud of it. When neighbors said I spoiled Michael, I ignored them. When my wife told me I was giving too much, I told her not to worry because one day our son would repay us with love. But I was wrong. What I thought was love was entitlement. What I thought was pride turned into arrogance. and what I thought was family turned into humiliation. Looking back now, I see it clearly. Every sacrifice I made only taught him to take more. Every gift I gave only made him demand the next one. My role as a father was twisted into that of a servant, and I was too blind to notice until it was too late. Yet at that time, before the night he threw water in my face, I still believed he would change. I still thought if I showed him patience, he would learn respect. I still thought if I stayed silent, he would remember the man who gave him everything. I thought wrong. The signs of disrespect started small, almost invisible, but they grew louder with time. At first, it was the way he spoke to me. Short answers, without eye contact, as if listening to me was a waste of his time. I used to sit in the living room and try to tell him stories about how I struggled when he was young. But he would roll his eyes and say, "Yeah, I know you worked hard. You've said that 100 times." He didn't see it as wisdom. He saw it as boring. I thought maybe it was just youth. Maybe he was busy with work or stress, so I excused it. But slowly, it became more obvious that he did not see me as his father anymore. He saw me as a burden. Whenever I asked for help with small things, like going to the store to pick up my medicine, he would sigh loudly and act like I had ruined his whole day. If I asked for a ride to the clinic, he would complain about gas money, as if the man who paid for his first car was now robbing him. The food in the house, which I contributed money for, suddenly became a subject of complaints. He would say things like, "Do you really need to eat that much rice? Or you're costing me more than my kids." It cut deep because I remembered nights when I stayed hungry so he could eat. Now the same son who ate from my hands was counting every grain I put on my plate. My medical bills became his favorite weapon. If I asked him to cover a prescription when I was short, he would mutter, "You're lucky I even let you stay here." I wanted to remind him that the house he lived in was built with my sweat, my back breaking under labor, my money poured into bricks and cement. But I stayed silent because I thought arguing with my own son would only push him further away. He liked to show off to neighbors and relatives that he was taking care of his old man. He would speak loudly about how I was living in his house, how he was paying for me, as if I were some charity case. I never corrected him even though the truth was different, because I didn't want outsiders to see the cracks in our family. But inside I was crumbling. His wife, Emily, followed his example. She would speak to me as if I were a guest who had overstayed my welcome. If I sat too long in the living room, she would switch off the TV and say she needed quiet. If I left my shoes near the door, she would make a face and tell me I was messy. Once, when I coughed at night, she shouted from her bedroom, "Old people should stay in nursing homes, not disturb the whole house." Michael heard it, and he didn't defend me. He laughed. That was the moment I realized the respect was completely gone. He started mocking my small needs. I have weak knees, and sometimes when I sit down, I make a sound without realizing it. He would imitate me in front of his friends, groaning loudly and holding his back as a joke. Everyone laughed except me. I sat in silence, feeling smaller every day. I asked myself, is this the son I raised? Is this the boy I carried on my shoulders? But there was no answer that could make sense of it. The arrogance only grew worse. When I tried to remind him of the sacrifices I made, he would cut me off with, "Stop living in the past. You did what you were supposed to do. Now it's my life." My existence was reduced to an obligation he never wanted. I was no longer the man who built his foundation. I was just the old man in the corner. He complained about grocery bills, about electricity, about medicine. Even though I still contributed money from my pension, he spoke as if every dollar I cost him was a theft, ignoring the millions I had put into his hands already. Sometimes he would say, "You're lucky I don't charge you rent," I wanted to shout. "You're living rent-free in the house I built." But I swallowed my words. Silence became my shield. I thought silence was strength. I thought patience would heal the disrespect. But patience only fed his entitlement. My son began acting like the master of the house, and I was reduced to a servant. He ordered me around. "Close the door. Turn off the light. Don't sit there." Each command was like a reminder that I no longer had dignity in my own home. Even the grandchildren started picking up his tone. They saw how their father spoke to me, and they copied it. They would laugh when I walked slowly. They would ignore me when I asked them questions. It wasn't their fault. They were children learning from their father. But it cut deep to see even their eyes lose respect for me. I carried this humiliation in silence. But inside I was boiling. I remembered the nights I worked 2 shifts so he could have Christmas presents under the tree. I remembered the time I pawned my only gold ring to pay for his school trip. I remembered the sacrifices no one else saw. The battles I fought alone just to give him a chance at life. And now that same son treated me as if I owed him. The respect was long gone. The dignity I expected in my old age never arrived. What replaced it was entitlement, arrogance, and mockery. I told myself this was my fault. I had spoiled him too much. I had given too much. I had never made him fight for his own survival. I thought love would teach gratitude, but instead it taught him greed. Every time I tried to reason with him, he dismissed me. Every time I tried to remind him of the truth, he silenced me. I was no longer a father in his eyes. I was a burden, a nuisance, a piece of old furniture taking up space. Those early signs of disrespect were not accidents. They were warnings of what was coming. And I ignored them until the night came when the disrespect turned into open humiliation, and there was no way to deny it anymore. It was a simple evening, nothing unusual, and I remember it clearly because ordinary nights often hide the moments that change everything. We sat down at the dinner table. Emily had cooked rice and vegetables, and the children were restless, playing with spoons instead of eating. I sat quietly in my chair, as I always did, waiting until everyone was served before I put food on my plate. I'd already learned not to reach first, because whenever I tried, I received irritated looks, so I waited. When the bowls came to me, I placed a small amount on my plate, enough to get by, and I ate slowly. My appetite is not what it used to be, but that night, after finishing what I had, I still felt hungry. I looked around, saw that there was still food left, and politely said, "Could I have a little more rice?" It was a simple request, something any father should be able to say in his son's house without fear. But the room went silent for a second. And then Michael's face twisted with annoyance. He looked at me as if I had insulted him. He didn't say a word at first, just grabbed the glass of water sitting beside his plate. Before I could understand what was happening, he leaned across the table and threw the water directly into my face. The cold splash hit me like a slap, my shirt soaked, my face dripping, the rice on my plate ruined. I sat frozen in shock, staring at him, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a joke. But it wasn't a joke. His eyes were hard, his mouth tight, and he said, "That's enough. Stop acting like a king in my house." My hands trembled as I wiped my face with a napkin. The children stared wide-eyed, not sure if they should laugh or be afraid. Emily chuckled awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood, but her eyes showed no sympathy for me. It felt like the whole table had turned against me, My heart didn't break because of the water. Water dries, clothes dry. But dignity once washed away in front of your own blood never dries. I sat there humiliated, unable to move, unable to defend myself. I thought about how many times I had stayed hungry so he could eat. I thought about the calluses on my hands, the broken bones, the years of labor that built the roof over his head. And here I was, treated like a beggar asking for scraps. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw back the water. I didn't curse him or walk out in anger. I just sat in silence, letting the water drip down my face, into my shirt, onto the floor, while Michael went back to eating as if nothing had happened. That silence was heavier than any scream I could have given. It was the silence of a father realizing his son no longer saw him as a father at all. The dinner table felt like a courtroom, and I had been sentenced without a defense. Every bite he took after throwing water in my face was a reminder that he saw me as less than him, less than family. I glanced at the grandchildren who were whispering to each other, smiling at the scene as if it were entertainment. That cut me deeper than the water. They were learning that mocking the old man was acceptable. They were learning that their grandfather's dignity was worthless. I wanted to get up and leave, but my legs felt like stone. I stayed in my seat until they finished their meal. No one offered me more food. No one apologized. When the plates were cleared, I stood slowly, my shirt clinging to my skin, and I walked back to my room. Behind me, I could hear laughter, the clinking of dishes, life going on as if humiliating me was just another casual event. In my room, I sat on the edge of my bed, water still dripping from my hair, and I looked at my hands. They were shaking, not from age, but from rage. I thought about the first time I held him as a baby, how small he was, how helpless, how I promised to protect him. And now that same child had thrown water in my face because I asked for food. My chest felt tight, not from the water, but from the realization that something inside me had broken. A father's pride, once cracked, cannot be repaired. I wiped my face with the towel, but I couldn't wipe away the memory. It was burned into me. I tried to sleep that night, but I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. Each time I saw the water fly across the table, my jaw clenched tighter. Each time I saw his eyes filled with arrogance, my heart grew colder. I knew then that the years of silent patience were over. I had lived through the early disrespect, hoping it would stop. I had endured the mocking, the complaints, the false claims that I was living in his house as charity. But this was different. This was not just disrespect. This was open humiliation. This was a message. You are nothing. And that was the moment I decided I would show him who was truly nothing. When I walked away from that dinner table and closed the door to my room, the silence inside those four walls was heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life. I sat on the edge of my bed with my shirt still damp, my skin sticky from the water, and I wiped my face slowly with my trembling hands. The humiliation stayed even after I dried off. The towel could take away the water, but it could not take away the feeling of being less than human in front of my own family. I looked at the mirror across the room, and for the first time, I did not recognize the man staring back. I saw a face lined with wrinkles from years of labor, eyes red, not just from age, but from holding back tears, and lips pressed together so tightly that not a single word could escape. I thought of every sacrifice that face had seen, every wound, every scar that came from putting someone else first. I thought of the times I went hungry, working late nights just so that Michael could eat 3 meals a day. I thought about the winters when I walked home with holes in my shoes while saving money to buy him a proper coat. And all of it flashed in my mind as I sat there humiliated because he threw water on me for asking for a spoon of rice. My heart felt cold. My body shook, not from the water, but from the realization that I had been blind for too long. That night, I could hear laughter from the other room. Emily was telling him something, and he chuckled as if nothing had happened. My humiliation was not even a matter to them. To them, it was an ordinary evening. To me, it was the night I buried the last piece of patience I had left. I laid down on my bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. Sleep would not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scene again. His arm reaching across, the glass tilting, the water splashing on my face. I felt the sting over and over. I thought about shouting. I thought about confronting him in front of everyone. But then I realized that shouting would give him satisfaction. He wanted me to break down, to react, to show weakness. So I stayed silent. Silence became my weapon that night. Not because I accepted the humiliation, but because I was already thinking of how to turn it back on him. I told myself, this silence will not end in defeat. This silence will end in his downfall. I remembered how I built his life. I remembered how much of my blood and sweat was poured into the accounts, the savings, the investments that carried his name, but were still under my authority. He laughed at me like I was nothing. But in truth, everything he believed was his was mine. I realized that night that my silence would be the last silence of humiliation. From that moment forward, it would become the silence of plotting. I wiped my face one more time, but this time it was not with shame. It was with a calm decision. He thought he washed away my dignity with water. He had no idea that in doing so he awakened something in me that had been asleep too long. My father's patience had been mistaken for weakness. But now my father's strength would return. I thought about how he would feel if one morning he woke up and realized the life he boasted about, the money he spent so carelessly, the power he believed he had was gone. I thought about his arrogance collapsing into panic, his confidence turning into fear. That image made me feel a small sense of peace. I did not want revenge for years. I wanted peace. But that night, I understood that peace for me could only come through justice. Quiet humiliation turned into quiet resolve. I promised myself that this moment, this water on my face, would not be the end of my story. It would be the turning point. I lay back on the bed and let my breathing slow. Outside, the family laughed. Plates clattered. The night went on as if nothing had happened. But inside my room, something was being built in silence. A plan, a decision, a resolve that no one could see. Michael thought he broke me. He thought the water made me powerless. But in reality, it was the final mistake he would ever make. From that night on, my silence was no longer the silence of weakness. It was the silence of a storm waiting to break. Lying awake that night, I kept thinking about everything Michael believed was his. He walked around the house as if he owned it. He boasted to neighbors that he was the one providing for me, and he spent money from accounts he thought belonged to him. What he forgot, or maybe never bothered to understand, was that I never surrendered control. I gave him access to the accounts so that he could learn responsibility. But I never removed my name, never handed over full ownership, never signed away my rights. The truth was simple. The house, the savings, the investments, every major asset was still legally under my name. He thought he was in charge because he had a card with his name on it. He thought that joint accounts meant he was the master. But the forgotten truth was that those accounts were mine, established with my years of labor, and I had allowed his name to sit beside mine only out of generosity. If I wanted, I could close them in a day. If I wanted, I could pull every dollar out without asking him a thing. He never knew that the real power never left my hands. I had simply been too trusting, too hopeful that he would value me, respect me, and treat me with dignity in my old age. I remembered the day we set up those accounts. The bank manager had looked at me and said, "Are you sure you want his name here too?" I smiled and said, "Yes, he is my son. I trust him." Those words felt like iron in my chest now. That trust had been repaid with water in my face. That trust had turned into humiliation. But that night, as I replayed the scene in my mind, I realized it was also my shield. My silence was not weakness. It was cover. Because while he thought he was humiliating a powerless old man, the truth was that I still held every string of his life. The forgotten truth was that his future was not built by his hands, but by mine. And at any moment, I could take it back. He had grown arrogant. He had mocked me. And he had called me lucky to live in his house. But the house deed had my name on it. He said I was costing him money, but the accounts he bragged about were funded by me. He said I was nothing, but in reality, without me, he was nothing. That was the truth he had forgotten. I sat up in bed and thought about how he strutted through life believing he was in control. I thought about how he threw parties, how he told people he was secure, how he flashed the bank card and acted like the money was endless. And all of it came from me. Every brick, every dollar, every ounce of stability. He had built his arrogance on a foundation that was never his. That night, the humiliation began to turn into something sharper. I no longer felt like a victim. I began to feel like a man holding a loaded weapon no one else knew about. Michael had grown entitled, but entitlement only exists as long as the provider stays silent. I was done being silent. I reminded myself again and again. I still had the authority. I still had the rights. I still had the ownership. He thought I was just an old man in a chair. But legally and financially, I was the one holding all the cards. And if I decided to pull them away, his life would collapse overnight. This forgotten truth gave me strength. It calmed the shaking in my hands. It turned my humiliation into fuel. He thought he had erased my dignity with one act. But I realized he had only given me a reason to act. I stayed in my room until morning, listening to the house settle into silence, listening to them sleep peacefully, thinking their world was intact. But I knew something they didn't know. I knew that the world they were living in belonged to me, and I could take it away whenever I chose. That realization made me breathe easier. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not cornered. I was not weak. I was not at his mercy. It was the other way around. He was at mine. The forgotten truth was power, and soon he was going to learn it the hard way. The very next morning, I woke up with a clear head and a decision burning inside me. I no longer felt like a man humiliated by water. I felt like a man holding the final card in a game that Michael didn't even know he was losing. I got dressed slowly, put on a clean shirt, and ate a quiet breakfast by myself in the corner. He didn't even look at me that morning, didn't bother to greet me as if I was invisible. That made my decision even stronger. I walked back to my room, took out the folder where I had kept all the bank documents, property deeds, and account details. I had been collecting them for years, keeping them safe because part of me always knew that trust can turn into betrayal. I looked at the papers, read through the names, and saw clearly what my next steps would be. The accounts were joint, but I had full authority as the primary holder. The house was in my name alone. The investments were under my identification. He believed everything was his, but on paper it was mine. That was the weapon. That was the plan. I picked up the phone and called the bank manager. He had known me for years, seen me deposit money month after month. I spoke calmly, asked him to check the accounts and verify once more who had the authority to move funds. He confirmed what I already knew. Only me. Michael had access, but no rights. His name was there for convenience, not ownership. The power was in my hands. I told the manager I wanted to schedule an appointment. He gave me a time that afternoon. I packed my documents into a bag and prepared. At lunch, I sat at the table quietly, not speaking a word, watching Michael laugh with Emily as if life was perfect. He didn't know that by evening his life would start to fall apart. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I stayed silent because the real battle wasn't going to be fought with words. It was going to be fought with signatures and transfers. In the afternoon, I went to the bank. The manager greeted me respectfully and I told him what I wanted. I wanted every dollar in those accounts moved into a new private account under my name only. No shared access, no joint signatures, nothing. Completely mine. He looked surprised but nodded. "It's your right," he said. I signed the forms, page after page, stroke after stroke. I erased Michael from the financial world he thought was his kingdom. By the time I left that office, $2.8 million had been shifted into an account he would never touch again. His name was erased from the accounts. His access card was canceled. The money he bragged about, the savings he flaunted, the future he believed secure, was gone in the space of one afternoon. I walked out of that bank feeling lighter than I had felt in years. My humiliation was no longer an open wound. It was a closed file. I had turned it into action. The plan was working, but I wasn't done. That evening when I returned home, he was sitting on the couch watching TV, laughing with Emily. He didn't even notice the change in my expression. He didn't know that I had just taken away everything from him. I sat down quietly, drank a glass of water, and kept my silence. I didn't say a word because the plan was not about confrontation. It was about watching his arrogance collapse on its own. I went to my room, packed some clothes into a suitcase, took my passport, my medicines, and my documents. I booked a ticket online, one way across the country. A new start, far away from his arrogance. He would not see it coming. He would wake up one morning and find his cards declined, his accounts empty, his world crumbling, and I would already be gone. I looked around the room one last time and felt no sadness. This was not my home anymore. This was my prison, and I was about to walk free. The plan was simple but final. Take everything back, leave without a word, and let him choke on the silence. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. The water he threw on my face had dried, but the stain on his soul would never wash away. He had mocked me for asking for more rice. Soon he would be begging for a single coin, and I would not be there to hear it. That was my plan, and it was already in motion. Once the transfer was complete and the money was secure, I knew the next step had to be quick and quiet. I could not give him even a chance to sense what was happening. If he caught even the smallest sign, he would try to stop me, argue, or maybe even try to use force. I was not going to let that happen. So, I moved carefully, like a man preparing for a journey no one else should know about. I pulled out my old suitcase, the same one I had used years ago when I traveled for work, and I began to pack. I did not take much, only what I needed: a few sets of clothes, my passport, my medicines, my personal documents, and a few photographs I wanted to keep. Everything else I left behind. I did not want weight. I wanted freedom. I folded my clothes neatly, tucked the papers into a hidden pocket, and zipped the bag shut. Then I sat on the bed for a moment, staring at the room that had been mine, but had never truly felt like mine. It was supposed to be my refuge in old age, but it had become a cage. I felt no sadness leaving it behind. If anything, I felt relief. I checked my phone and confirmed the booking I had made the night before: a one-way ticket across the country. I chose a place where no one would look for me, a coastal town in California where I could live quietly without interference. where no one would know Michael's name or my humiliation. I arranged for the flight in 2 days, enough time to prepare, but not enough time for anyone to notice. During those 2 days, I kept my behavior normal. I ate my meals silently. I sat in my corner of the living room when needed, and I stayed out of their way. Michael mocked me once again for being quiet, saying, "Old man has nothing to say anymore." I smiled inside because he had no idea that soon he would have everything to say and nothing left to hold. I withdrew small amounts of cash to avoid suspicion spread across different branches until I had enough in hand to carry with me. I contacted my lawyer through email, telling him to prepare a sealed letter to be delivered to Michael after my departure. I instructed him not to mention where I went, only to confirm that my decision was final. The lawyer agreed, and I trusted him to carry it out. On the final night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the laughter from the television in the other room, and I felt a strange calm. I knew this was the last night I would ever hear those sounds. At dawn, I dressed, carried my suitcase, and left the house without a word. No one noticed me leave. Michael was asleep. Emily was snoring beside him, and the children were lost in their dreams. I stepped outside into the cool morning air and felt a weight lift off my chest. The street was quiet, the sky slowly turning light, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking as a free man. I called for a taxi and went straight to the airport. The ride was long, but I didn't look back. I kept my eyes forward, watching the city fade into the distance, knowing I was erasing myself from their lives. At the airport, I went through the motions calmly, checked my bag, showed my passport, and waited at the gate. Around me were families, couples, travelers rushing to vacations. But I sat silently, a man leaving not for pleasure, but for justice. When my boarding was called, I walked down the tunnel with steady steps. I sat in my seat, buckled the belt, and stared out the window as the plane began to move. When it lifted off the ground, I felt the final chain break. I was gone. Michael would wake up and find nothing. No father, no money, no foundation. His kingdom built on arrogance had collapsed overnight. I imagined his face when he tried to use his card and found it declined. I imagined the panic in his voice when he called the bank and was told he had no rights left. I imagined him running through the house, searching for me, only to find my room empty, my belongings gone, and silence in the air. That was my disappearance. Not loud, not violent, but complete. I left without a trace, without a forwarding address, without a clue. I erased myself from his world, the way he tried to erase my dignity. While the plane cut through the clouds, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I was no longer humiliated. I was no longer the old man mocked at the dinner table. I was a man who had taken back what was his and vanished before anyone could stop him. That was the beginning of my new life and the end of his. The morning I disappeared, Michael woke up as if it was just another day. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and started talking loudly to Emily about some bills he planned to pay and plans he had for the weekend. He reached into his wallet, pulled out his bank card, and told her he would take care of the payments after breakfast. He tried to log into his account on his phone, and that was the first moment his smile faded. The screen showed an error. He tried again, typing harder, his brows furrowed. Still the same message. He muttered to himself, annoyed, and reached for his other card. He swiped it through the payment app to pay a bill, and the card was declined. He laughed awkwardly, thinking maybe the system was down. But when he tried at least 3 more times, the reality started to sink in. Emily looked at him confused, asking what was going on, and he brushed her off, saying it was a bank error. But inside, panic was building. He picked up the phone and called the bank. The line connected, and after verifying his details, the bank officer told him calmly that the account he was trying to access no longer had his name attached to it. The rights were revoked, the cards were canceled, and his access was permanently removed. Michael's voice rose, demanding answers, saying there must be a mistake. But the bank officer repeated the same words. He had no rights, no access, no control. The accounts were solely under my name, and the transfers had already been finalized. The money was gone. His voice cracked in fury, shouting into the phone, but no amount of anger could change the system. He hung up and dialed again, hoping to get someone else. But the answer was the same. He was powerless, by now. Emily was growing nervous, asking what he meant by gone. He tried to lie, saying it was a temporary block, but she pressed harder, and his silence gave him away. His arrogance from the night before had vanished. His face turned pale, his hands shook, and he realized that everything he thought was his, the savings, the security, the future, had vanished overnight. He ran through the house shouting my name, searching for me. But when he opened my room, he found only the empty bed, the bare shelves, and the quiet echo of absence. My suitcase was gone. My documents were gone. My presence was gone. That silence was the loudest punishment of all. He called my phone repeatedly, but I had already turned it off and discarded the SIM card. He sent message after message, his words moving from anger to panic to begging. First he wrote, "What have you done?" Then, "You can't do this to me." And later, "Please, Father, let's talk." But none of those words reached me. I had already erased that line of connection. Emily stood in the kitchen, staring at him in disbelief, realizing that the man who boasted about being in control had nothing left. The children watched him pacing, yelling, then collapsing into a chair with his head in his hands. For the first time, they saw their father powerless. For the first time, they saw fear in his eyes. He tried driving to the bank, demanding to speak to the manager. But the bank stood firm. They showed him the documents I had signed. Legally, he was nothing. He walked out of that bank, a shadow of the man who once strutted through its doors. His arrogance had no ground left to stand on. The calls he made to friends went unanswered once they realized he could not repay what he owed them. The bills piled up with no money to cover them. The lifestyle he had flaunted began to collapse piece by piece. Emily grew cold toward him, asking why he lied, why he made her believe they were secure, when in truth it had all come from me. The arguments between them grew louder each night, and the neighbors began to whisper. The man who once mocked his father for asking for food was now scrambling to figure out how to feed his own family. The panic turned into shame, and the shame turned into silence. The humiliation he gave me at that dinner table returned to him tenfold. The aftermath of my departure was not just the loss of money. It was the loss of his image, his pride, his power, and his control. He learned that a man who throws water at his father should be prepared to have his future drained dry. He thought I was weak. He thought I was old and useless. But when the truth came crashing down, he was the one left empty. That was the aftermath. His arrogance burned to ashes, his family shaken, his future erased, and my silence louder than any revenge speech I could have given. Weeks passed after my disappearance, and Michael's life was falling apart piece by piece. His arrogance had been replaced by desperation. His phone calls to me went unanswered, his messages unread. His attempts to track me all failed. He went to relatives asking if they had seen me, But no one knew anything because I had told no one. Emily grew colder every day, blaming him for the disaster, and his children began to sense that the security they once enjoyed was gone. The man who once strutted with pride now walked with shoulders bent, head down, and eyes full of worry. But I was not finished. I wanted one final strike, not with money or property, but with words that would cut deeper than anything else. That is why I had arranged with my lawyer before leaving. I had given him a sealed envelope to be delivered to Michael weeks after my disappearance. Inside, it was a single note. My lawyer waited, watching as the chaos grew until the right time came. Then one afternoon, as Michael sat in his living room surrounded by unpaid bills, Emily angry and his children silent, there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find the lawyer standing there with an envelope. Michael looked confused, asked what it was, and the lawyer simply said, "From your father." Michael's hands shook as he tore it open. The letter inside was short, only 2 sentences written in my handwriting. It said, "You threw water on my face. I drained the life you thought was yours." That was all. No signature, no return address, nothing else. Just finality. Michael read the words over and over, his face changing from anger to disbelief to sorrow. Emily leaned over, read it too, and walked away without a word. The silence in that room was heavier than anything he had ever felt before. He realized in that moment that this was not a mistake, not a temporary punishment, but the permanent consequence of his actions. He tried to call the lawyer back, demanding to know where I was, but the lawyer simply repeated what I had instructed him to say. "Your father made his decision. That is all you need to know." Michael shouted, begged, threatened, but nothing worked. The lawyer left, and Michael stood alone in the doorway, holding the paper that ended his world. That small note was more powerful than any confrontation. It reminded him of the night he had humiliated me, of the moment he thought I was powerless, and it showed him how wrong he had been. He understood that respect cannot be bought, and once lost, it cannot be recovered. He understood that his father was not weak, not helpless, but the very foundation he had stood on. And when that foundation was removed, he had nothing left. He kept the note, maybe hoping that one day I would return, but I never would. That message was the last connection between us. A reminder, a punishment, and a truth carved into his mind forever. After sending that final message through my lawyer, I closed the last chapter of my life with Michael. I did not check for replies. I did not ask for updates. I did not want to hear about his downfall directly. My revenge was not about watching him cry or beg. My revenge was about making sure he understood that he had destroyed the very bridge that carried him through life. And now he would have to face the emptiness alone. I started my new life in a quiet coastal town in California, far away from the house where I had been humiliated. Here, no one knew my name, no one knew my past, and no one called me a burden. I rented a small apartment near the sea, simple but peaceful. In the mornings, I walked along the shoreline, breathing in the salt air, feeling the sand under my feet, and listening to the waves crash against the rocks. Each step reminded me that I was free, that I had taken back my dignity. In the afternoons, I sat at a cafe with a newspaper, sipping coffee slowly, not worrying about anyone mocking me or rushing me. At night, I cooked simple meals, small portions that I enjoyed without anyone rolling their eyes. Life became quiet, but it was a quiet that healed me instead of breaking me. Sometimes I thought about Michael, and I wondered if he still tried to explain to Emily everything was gone, or if he still looked at that note in anger or regret. But those thoughts no longer hurt me. They reminded me of my justice. He had thrown water on me, trying to wash away my dignity in front of his family, but in return, I had washed away his future with the stroke of a pen. He had forgotten that everything he had came from me, and I made sure he remembered it in the harshest way possible. My lawyer later wrote to me once, not with details, but with reassurance that my instructions had been followed completely, that there was nothing left for Michael to claim. The accounts were mine. The house had been shifted, the investments secured. Michael was left with only his pride, and pride cannot feed a family. That was his punishment. My justice was not about shouting, not about fists, not about fights. It was about silence, papers, and finality. Justice for me was not seeing him suffer. It was knowing he could no longer control me, no longer humiliate me, no longer pretend he was the master of what I built. Justice was walking along the sea with no weight on my shoulders. Justice was knowing that when he looked at his empty bank account, he would remember that moment at the dinner table for the rest of his life. He would remember the water. He would remember my silence. And he would understand too late that his father was never powerless. In the end, he lost everything because he could not give the smallest thing: respect.